Hello, Hannah. Welcome to Intelligence Squared.
Hi, thanks very much for having me.
Well, it was my pleasure. I'm delighted we're going to be able to get to talk about this book, Not the End of the World. I don't know whether I should hold it on this side or it's probably going to be mirrored
I've
in
also
the
got a
final version.
copy, so
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, you go for it. So I love reading the book. Margaret Atwood also loved reading the book, so that's probably more important than the fact that I love reading it. But I did love reading it. It actually took me back to it's going to sound rather strange. It took me back to my early days of courting because my wife was an environmentalist. And when I met her, she'd studied this environmental master's degree, and all her friends had studied this environmental master's degree. And so they're all environmentalists, and they're all talking about food miles on organic food. And quite a lot of what you were talking about in the book basically just reminded me of me going, well, yes, that sounds very plausible. But is that actually what the data show? So we're gonna get geeky. We're going to talk about saving the world. We're going to talk about the data, and I will try not to talk any more about how I met my wife because that's of no interest to anybody. So just tell us, first of all, what's the big picture? What is this book about?
So I think to start with, I think the concept seems quite bold, but hopefully it'll make sense. My core argument in the book is that I think we have the opportunity to be the first generation to be sustainable. Now, when you first think of that, that sounds quite controversial because I'm implying that no generation before has been sustainable. But the reason I make that argument is historically, societies might have been environmentally sustainable, so they weren't degrading the environment for future generations. But in order to do that, they often had very low living standards. So, as an example I give is that for most of human history, about half of children died before reaching puberty. So, living standards were often low. Now, what's happened over the last few centuries is that human living conditions have really massively improved across the world on many, many metrics. But that has come at the cost of the environment. We've burned fossil fuels for energy, we've cut down forests to grow more food. And so we've been balanced one way and we've tipped the other way. And the core argument of the book is I think we have the opportunity, if we make the right decisions and get moving, that we can achieve both of these things at the same time. We can provide a good life for everyone without degrading the environment.
So you phrase it there in a very practical way, and you come across in the book as a very practical person. Like these are things that we can do. These are the steps that we need to take. There is a much more optimistic framing in your book than in most of the books I read about the environment. Though I mean, maybe the clues in the title, "Not the End of the World." One of the first things you say is, "Look, we are not actually doomed, and it's not helpful to think that we are doomed." So why was that one of the first points that you wanted to make? That the doomsday thinking isn't helpful?
Because I think I've done my background's environmental science. I did that all through university. And at the end of my degree there, I really did feel this kind of level of doom of I've done all the science, I've done all the work behind the scenes, but now I feel kind of incapable to change things because I really felt like nothing could change and these problems weren't solvable. And I think since then I've just seen that feeling grow over time. Like I know from the emails I get from people that they really feel like these are big problems, but there's just nothing we can do about it. I see it often in headlines. I'm seeing increasing levels of doom around me. And I think that's not particularly constructive to us moving forward. If we step back and say we give up, there's nothing we can do about it, then that's a surefire way of making sure that we don't fix these problems. So my core argument in the book is we need to push back and we need to say, yes, these problems are solvable. Let's get going.
The book reminded me in some ways of a couple of other books that I'm sure you know. One was Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now, and Steven Pinker's book refers a lot to the data from the Our World in Data website, which you are, you're one of the main moving forces behind that website. And the other book it reminds me of is Hans Rosling's Factfulness. And I know a lot of people have read those books. So tell me a little bit about how you would compare your book to them, what's different about what you're saying, and what are the commonalities?
So I think the commonalities is that our core argument is if you step back to look at the data, you often get a very different picture from what you would build just by looking at news headlines and having a rather narrow view of the world. I think where it's really different is that I only really focus on these human measures, so child mortality, poverty, maternal mortality, in the really first chapter of the book. And the reason I do that is because I think as environmentalists, we often just don't get that picture of what's actually happening to human well-being. So I think it's important to get that across. But in the rest of the book, it's completely focused on our environmental problems, which I think Hans Rosling and Steven Pinker did much less of.
Yeah. So you're looking at the same data and you reach the same conclusion, which is things are great as long as this is in some way sustainable, or at least as long as it can become sustainable before we degrade the environment irreparably. And then I guess then the what's radical about what you're saying is actually we can make this sustainable. We have got some big problems, but they're fixable, and we've had big problems in the past, and we've fixed them.
Yeah, I think I see us as at the moment at a bit of a crossroads where we've, as you've said, all of these trends are largely getting better for most people in the world. And we're at a kind of fork in the road where we can go down a path where these continue to improve and we manage to fix our environmental problems at the same time, or we don't fix our environmental problems. And actually, you have the issue that some of these measures could start to regress. Hunger could start to regress, deaths from natural disasters could go upwards. There are a range of human metrics which could be impacted by our continued environmental damage. And yeah, as you say, like when you step back to look at the data, there are obviously really, really worrying signs in a lot of the data, but there are also stories of success. And I think it's important to bring those stories of success out so that we get this understanding that, yes, these are big challenges, but we have solved many of them in the past and we can continue to do that.
So let's talk a bit about air pollution, and because there were some key success stories there, and I want to talk about what that teaches us or what it doesn't teach us about how we can deal with climate change. So, and what are the really, I mean, I'm a nerd, so I know some of the stuff in your book, and yet I kept coming across things that that one I didn't know, or I've never seen it that way. So one of the points that you make in the book that surprised me is you take one of the cities with a reputation for the worst air pollution today, which is Delhi, and you compare it to Victorian London, and Victorian London was worse. And that really took me by surprise. So we had an air pollution problem, and we've done an awful lot to fix it in the UK. So how did that happen? Was that regulation? Is that a technological change? What's going on there?
Yeah, there's maybe like other air pollution related problems we can come on to, but the local air pollution in London, yeah, I think we kind of forget that many of our cities in the rich world today, you go back a century and they were extremely polluted. Like London is one example. I'm in Edinburgh, so we were called the Auld Reekie, so really polluted city. London was the big smoke, and it was the big smoke because smoke was filled the air. And there are stories of the big London smog where, I mean, people were walking down the street, they couldn't see in front of them. They were shuffling along trying to feel for the curb because the air was so polluted. And a big driver of that was coal burning. So now we think of coal burning as just producing electricity in a power plant. But historically, we would often just burn coal in our houses and it would go out the chimney and into the streets. So you had this really thick blanket of air pollution.
You're younger than me. I remember this. I mean, I grew up in a coal mining area in Derbyshire, and yeah, I had we had I think we had a gas fire. We didn't have a coal fire, but friends of mine had a coal bunker and had a coal fire. That's what you did.
Yeah. So what some of the success stories there is, one is just moving away from coal. That the UK has made amazing progress on moving away from coal. We basically don't burn any coal anymore, which has happened actually very quickly in the space of a few decades. We've put in really strict pollution controls on power plants, so that's government policy. Another big source of air pollution has been cars on the road, and we often look outside now and think our streets must be the most polluted they've ever been. Look at the number of cars spewing toxic fumes out the back. But car manufacturers actually have had increasingly strict regulations on how much of these pollutants they can emit. And if you look at the data, you just see that pollution has significantly decreased.
Yeah, I was quite struck by the fact that there's this enormous fuss about the ultra low emission zone in London, and I guess I'd kind of assumed that you had to be basically driving an electric car and it's ultra low emissions, but just you can drive a modern diesel car into London. It's fine. It's perfectly legal, perfectly within the limits of the zone. So it reminded me or underlined to me that you can have what a lot of people regard as draconian regulations, but actually modern cars are so clean that they meet those standards.
Yeah, and that applies to local air pollutants, but it also applies to CO2 emissions. So cars have also just become increasingly efficient over time, such that you can also drive declines in CO2 emissions for these technologies. Now, it's not to say that air pollution in our cities are perfect. In the UK, we still have at least the estimates are like tens of thousands of premature deaths every year. It was more in the past, and the point is, you can look at these trends and say, oh, it's possible to make progress here. How can we squeeze out that last bit so we don't have tens of thousands still dying?
Yeah. Now, you said you wanted to talk about other forms of air pollution. You have a couple of case studies in the book. You talk about acid rain, what we did about acid rain. You talk about the ozone hole, what we did about the ozone hole. So just give us the quick précis there. And then does that tell us something about how to cope with climate change, or are they false parallels?
I think the difference there is I think you can use the local air pollution example to show that it's possible to make progress. I think some people would push back and say, well, okay, like countries can do that at a local level because they care about their own people.
Mm-hmm.
But the struggle is when you try to work together in international collaboration. But the ozone layer and acid rain problem are like perfect examples of where countries really did work together, often not really in their personal interests, but realized that there was a collective problem. And the ozone hole, I don't remember it, like it was before my time, but
You're so young. You're so young.
but I mean, these
I
were
remember. Sorry, I'm sounding like a really old man here, but I remember the acid rain. I remember the ozone hole. I remember when we were really, really worried about this. I was born in the early 1970s, so I was a school kid in the 80s. We were really worried about this stuff in the 1980s, and yet these problems. I don't think it's complacent to say we've basically solved both those problems.
yeah, I mean, the ozone hole, the gases, the CFCs that depleted the ozone layer, we've basically reduced them by more than 99% now. So we've kind of done the job of stopping those emissions. The ozone hole is still there and it will take decades to close, but really there's nothing more we can do about it. We've stopped emitting the gases. We just need to wait for it to heal. And the same with acid rain across Europe and North America, like our emissions of sulfur dioxide, which is what causes acid rain, are many countries have reduced emissions by more than 90%. So we
Mm-hmm.
really emit very little of these gases now. So you could essentially say, yes, these two problems we've solved, and we just don't really hear about them anymore.
Yeah. So the argument. So I mean, that obviously suggests, hey, we can solve these problems. We can get together. These were all collective action problems, and so is climate change. So basically, it's the same thing, it's just a bit bigger. I guess the counter argument would be. I remember talking to Thomas Schelling, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, shortly after he won the Nobel Memorial Prize, and he's a game theorist. He's interested in collective action problems. And he actually said he felt that climate change was more like the Marshall Plan. He was actually involved in negotiating the Marshall Plan way back in the 1940s. It's about burden sharing. It's about who's going to stump up the cost and who's not. It's a much more expensive problem. And he was worried because with the Marshall Plan, you had the US basically sitting over it, setting deadlines and saying, you guys have got to agree. As to who's going to pay, who's going to get the benefits, and we don't have that same time constraints with climate change. Or at least we don't have an artificial deadline. We don't have someone imposing that deadline, and that maybe we won't really get around to solving it. You're more optimistic than that. One way or another, you think we have made a lot of progress.
Yeah, and I don't think it's going to be easy, and I don't think it's the ozone problem or the acid rain problem is a perfect parallel. I think climate change is just much harder to solve. So I largely agree with his analysis there.
Do you want to take a moment to explain to everyone why it's a harder problem than, say, ozone?
Yeah, so the problem with ozone is that we were using these specific gases, CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, in refrigerators, deodorants, a small subset of stuff that we used. And we got to the point where there was just basically a basic substitute. You could just take the CFCs out and put something else in its place. And initially it was maybe a little bit more expensive, but it was kind of a one-for-one substitution within a really small number of goods.
Hmm.
So once we did that, the problem was largely solved. The
Yeah.
problem with climate change is like we literally need to change everything. We need to change the way we produce energy, the way we move around, the food we eat, the way we build stuff. Like it's a full economy wide problem. So I think that's part of the reason why it's so much harder.
Yeah.
What gives me,
Yeah. So how's it going? What gives you hope?
um, we're still very far off track from where we need to be. But what gives me optimism that we have a shot of actually tackling this is we've actually made quite a lot of progress in the last decade. It sounds unbelievable, but we actually have. So we're currently on track for around 2.5 degrees. That's kind of the median estimate of where our current policies are taking us. Now, that's very bad.
That's global average temperatures relative to the long run average.
Pre-industrial,
It's where we're going to end up. I mean, that's not where we are now, but that's where it looks like we'll end up.
Yeah, by the end of the century.
Yeah, and is that bad? Sorry to ask the dumb question.
No.
Is that a problem?
That's bad. That's really bad.
Mm-hmm.
We've set targets of trying to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees and well below 2 degrees. If not, we won't reach the 1.5 degree target. We're going to go past 1.5 degrees. So in that regard, I'm not this like crazy optimist. I think if you'd asked me a decade ago, I would have said two degrees was completely unfeasible as well. I'm becoming slightly more optimistic that we can get close to that range, although we're currently headed for 2.5.
Yeah.
And the reason for that, and the reason I'm optimistic, and I think what maybe goes slightly against the quote you gave earlier, is that I think if it was true a decade ago that it was very expensive to tackle climate change, right? If you look at any of the technologies we need to switch to, so solar or wind or electric vehicles, they were all far more expensive than coal or gas or a petrol car.
Yeah.
So it really was like, are you willing to sacrifice the economy and put your money on the line in order to solve this? And a lot of countries just weren't.
Yeah. I was talking to, just for context, I was talking to Schelling in 2005. He'd been writing about this problem since I think the 1970s. And, you know, as you say, as of 2005, that's solar. I mean, solar is just a pipe dream, right? It's, you know, that's not a real option, is it? But now it is.
Yeah, so over the last decade, the price of solar has fallen by 90%, the price of wind has fallen by 70%. Electric cars are starting to reach price parity with a petrol car. So your solar and wind are now the cheapest technologies we can put in instead of coal or gas. So I think regardless of climate change, many countries will actually just start to do this because it's the cheapest option. So I think we need to stop framing this as are you willing to sacrifice the economy in order to solve climate change? Because I think that's a false dichotomy. And that's why I'm a bit more optimistic now than I was a decade ago.
Yeah. Are you worried about solving the intermittency problem? Because batteries are a lot cheaper, but batteries don't solve everything. You know, that the classic, you know, what happens at, 5:30 in a December evening, everyone comes home, Northern Hemisphere, the wind's not blowing, the sun's not shining, it's cold. How do you solve that problem without burning carbon?
So I think that it's a big challenge, but I think it's a solvable problem. The intermittency problem is different on different timescales. So for evening out like peaks throughout the day on the basis of like hours, batteries work well. For longer term storage, you might be looking at other options such as hydrogen, or we're now talking about maybe methanol, like storing it as a liquid fuel, which is easier than a battery over longer time periods. So I think we will have a range of solutions at different time scales in order to balance that. And then I think on the demand side, we'll actually just change things a lot. I think like a problem you might see is if we all move to electric vehicles, the problem you'll get is in the evening, everyone will come home, they'll start cooking, they'll turn on the heating, they'll start charging the electric vehicle. I think what you're going to get is a very different electricity system where pricing will often operate and go with when supply is highest. So you'll
Yeah.
get really cheap electricity when the sun is shining or the wind's blowing. And I think we'll actually start to adapt to that. So you'll shift your electric car charging to a time when it's not peak demand, for example.
Yeah.
So I think
And
it's
probably to help people imagine this, it's more likely that your car will do that. You'll plug your car in and your car will check the internet and go, this is expensive. I'm actually going to sell. I'm not going to charge. I'm actually going to discharge. I'm going to sell my electricity back to the grid. And then when the wind starts blowing again, suddenly electricity is cheap. Then I'm going to charge up. And you'll be able to program your car. You'll say find the cheapest price or charge up at any cost. And you won't be constantly having to think about this as a consumer.
Yeah, I think it's a big challenge, but I think what people don't appreciate is that there are a lot of smart people already doing this on the national grid. Like the fact that your supply and demand is fluctuating all the time, even on a fossil fuel based system, and it nearly always works. So there's really smart people working on this balancing all the time, and the people I spoke to that work for national grids, they are pretty confident that this is a solvable problem.
Mm-hmm. Now, not long ago, are you a park runner, Hannah? Do you do park run?
I've done a few. I really like running. I just don't really do park
You
run.
don't really do park run. Well, I only do park run. That's my only source of running. Not long ago, I did a Sizewell park run, where you basically run up the coast of Suffolk, past this massive nuclear power station and back. And I guess there's two types of runners in the world: those that are delighted to run past the nuclear power station, and those that are less than happy about it. Would you be happy to run past a nuclear power station? Would you be happy if there were more nuclear power stations for us to run past?
Yeah, I think it's like a very contentious subject, but I'm pro nuclear as much as I'm pro renewables.
Mm-hmm.
My general from looking at the data, I think there's lots of concerns around safety, and I think when you actually break down the data in the book, I look at like number of deaths per unit of electricity produced, and we've had a few big nuclear accidents. I think more people assume more people died in those accidents
Mm-hmm.
than actually did. But when you look at the numbers, it's just very clear nuclear is much safer than fossil fuels. You have a pretty
And that's without factoring in climate change. That's just looking at the people who die as a result of kind of the mining of the coal, or are we including the deaths from local air pollution? What are we including in that in that calculation?
Yeah, we're including supply chains and the mining, and the big one for fossil fuels is air pollution.
Mm-hmm.
We're not factoring in climate change. So if you also factored in climate change, fossil fuels would be even worse.
Yeah.
So for me, it's this less of a framing of are you going to go for solar and wind or are you going to go for nuclear? It's how can we move away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible? And
Yeah.
I'm pretty much pro anything that helps us get there faster. So
Yeah.
there's lots of different reasons you might or might not want to install nuclear, whether it's cost or construction time. So there's lots of decisions about whether you want to build a new one. What I definitely don't think we should do is shut down our existing ones because we're just shooting ourselves in the foot. When we install renewables, we'll start to be replacing the existing nuclear when we should really be replacing the fossil fuels.
Yeah. I want to talk some more about various environmental issues that you discuss in the book. I mean, it's so fun. It's so interesting. It's really inspiring. Before I do that, I wanted to kind of take a step sideways. What you do again and again in the book is say, look, here's an issue. What's going on? Let's look at the data. Like, how bad is this? How bad is this in different parts of the world? How bad is this today versus 10 years ago or 50 years ago or 100 years ago? Let's actually look at the data, the best data that we have. So just as a really foundational question, how trustworthy is that data? How much can we believe those numbers? And do you feel that they're all absolutely solid, or there are some that you're more worried about than others?
I think I try really hard to make sure I'm only sourcing from reliable sources. I mean, you can find data that would support any argument that you want in the world, probably.
I thought I found a mistake, and then I checked the references, and no, I didn't.
um,
You'll be pleased to hear.
I'm relieved. Yeah, like the sources I rely on for most of these things, like the data is pretty solid. Like we have good data on CO2 emissions, for example. We have like reasonable reconstructions of air pollution emissions. Where there's not really long term data, I try to piece together an overview from a range of different sources. So if you take air pollution as the example, we have reasonable reconstructions of emissions of air pollution by looking at the amount of fuel we're burning and where we're burning it, etc. For the last 200 years or so. We don't have a lot of data previous to there. So when it gets to that stage, I try to understand what air pollution might have been like a bit further in the past. And we can't use data for that, but we can use archaeological evidence. So in the book I referenced like um, mummy like lung tissue, you can see that it's actually there's been air pollution there, or looking at historical anecdotes where I think I quote Marcus Aurelius as saying, "Oh, he was so glad to get out of Rome because the air was filthy and he could like think clearly again once he left Rome." It's clearly pointing to air pollution is not just this modern problem; it was also a problem in the past. So I think it's a mix of we have really for most of the stuff we have like pretty good solid data, and where we don't, I try to be very clear that this is a big data gap and we need to fill it. And then trying to piece the story together, you need to draw on different strands of evidence.
So let's talk about food, if we can. Your special subject, I understand. This is what your PhD was actually in, was sustainability of food. So there's a story in your book that just made me despair of you sitting next to, in a canteen next to an environmental lecturer. It was somebody who actually had taught you when you were a student. And this person ordered the lamb. You ordered something vegetarian, and then explained to you that it was fine to order the lamb because actually the climate change impact wasn't that big because it was local lamb. There's so much. I have so many feelings about that story. Just tell me why you told that story and what it makes you feel.
I told that story, I think, partly to demonstrate that even people that work in this field don't necessarily always get it right and don't necessarily always base their decisions based on the data, which if you look at the data would show that like the inference should have been the other way around. But I think it's also...
I mean, we should say, so lambs are ruminant. Lambs are ruminant. Lamb, sheep, they produce a lot of methane. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. It's bad. It's bad. If you're worried about climate change, lamb is not a great thing to eat. And how far the lamb has to travel before it gets to your plate is really a side issue.
Yeah, as a fraction, the transport component is a fraction of the impact. So like my number one recommendation on food, if you want to reduce your carbon footprint, is to eat less meat, but specifically beef and lamb. And it doesn't matter whether it's local. Your local lamb might be better than lamb from a different country, but it's not better
Might not
than the
be.
vegetarian.
I mean,
No, it
lamb
depends on where it's
from New
produced. New
Zealand is
Zealand.
probably slightly better than lamb from Wales. Sorry,
Right.
everyone listening in Wales, but sorry. But what got me about that story was this person was literally their job to know this, right? It wasn't just some random person who was vaguely worried about the planet and had made a bad choice because they weren't that well informed. I mean, I get it. We can't all know everything until, of course, we read Not the End of the World, in which case we do suddenly know everything in very clear ways. But how is it possible to be a lecturer in environmental sciences and to profess to care about this stuff and to care enough about this stuff to be patronizing you on the topic and yet to have no idea? That's what I couldn't quite absorb about that.
I mean, I think people just they maybe have one specific area that they work in or lecture in, and then the rest of the stuff they base on intuition. And I
Yeah,
think the intuition there seems right, and I get why people make that mistake. They imagine transport, that means flying or shipping or a big truck that
yeah,
obviously emits lots of CO2. Therefore, the further it travels, the worse it is.
yeah. The very
Um,
word food miles is designed. I mean, it's very clever marketing. It's designed to remind people of air miles. So you think this joint of lamb is like it's basically strapped in first class, being served champagne and warm nuts on the way over to my plate. But of course,
right.
it's not how it works, right?
No, it's not. And when you look at, I mean, food is a massive contributor to climate change. It's around a quarter to a third of greenhouse gas emissions. But the transport part is only 5% of food emissions globally. Nearly all of the emissions come from land use change, so deforestation and using the land, and emissions on the farm. So when it comes to ruminants, as you say, it's emitting methane. Those are the big contributors to the carbon footprint of your food. It's not about the distance it's travelled.
Yeah. I mean, I'm interested in how poor some people's intuitions are about this. I mean, I suppose my instinct as an economist is that, and this isn't always right, but if something's cheap, it's probably actually not consuming loads of resources because resources are expensive. And of course, some resources, like the capacity of the atmosphere to absorb carbon dioxide, are underpriced. Right, so the price doesn't always tell you about the resource consumption, but as a first approximation, like if something's really cheap, like if they're willing to give you the plastic bag at the supermarket for nothing, it's probably not a huge amount of oil in that plastic bag. It probably didn't take a huge amount of energy to produce that plastic bag because like all this stuff costs money. And the fact that stuff gets flown all over the world and it shows up in the supermarket and it's all cheap, that sort of tells me that those transport networks probably aren't, in fact, consuming huge amounts of resources, because if they were consuming huge amounts of resources, all this stuff would be super expensive. I don't know. Maybe that's the wrong way to think about it, but that's my first cut. And I often find that when I see people who've actually done the work, like you, the results are not often that different from that very simple kind of, price guided heuristic.
Yeah, I think that's a good rule of thumb. When it comes to the transport of the food, the reason that the impact of transport is often not that big is that most of the food that travels internationally comes by ship, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't fly it because flying is carbon intensive and it's expensive, right? They're not going to do that unless they really have to fly it to you because it's expensive. So most of it's shipped, and shipping has a very low carbon intensity in terms of travel. So most of the stuff that's coming to you is not flown, it's shipped for that specific reason that it's actually expensive to fly.
Yeah. It is interesting the things that people do get wrong. I mean, I know what one of your inspirations is Hans Rosling, and one of the things that Hans Rosling always used to love to do is ask people questions that they would get dramatically wrong. But you talk about, I mean, it's a very kind book. You are not mean about people in the book. You could be mean, but you're just better than that, Hannah. So it's a very sort of kind, generous book, just giving people information. But there are things you talk about in the book that, were you inclined, you could be very rude about, like vertical farms or people's obsession with plastic straws. You just look at the amount of stuff that people put in the bin every week, and you think, is the straw really the issue? Or yeah, so I mean, why do we get this stuff so wrong?
Um, I actually don't have a good answer to why we get this stuff. I mean, the plastic straws, I don't get why we get that wrong. It just doesn't make any intuitive sense to me. I think there's some stuff that it seems a bit more intuitive to me why people would get, like, I kind of get the local food stuff. Like
Mm-hmm.
I do get it. It seems kind of intuitive.
Yeah, and
There's
it's
other
nice to
examples.
think about supporting local businesses. I mean, that's
Yeah.
all. Yeah,
Yeah, I think there's other reasons beyond carbon footprint why someone might want to buy local, and that's fine. But I think it's sad if they do that thinking that it's much better for the environment when it's not. There's other examples, like people often assume that organic food is just automatically better than non-organic food, when actually the data would suggest otherwise. And again, I kind of intuitively get it. It feels green, it feels natural. I think that's what our environmental kind of inclinations are built on, is like green, natural, like no artificial inputs. So I think maybe that part of it comes into it, is that we have this kind of gut feeling of, I often frame it as like this feeling of like we want to kind of go backwards in time. Like we think this is the past was really sustainable. If we could just get back there, where we kind of all had our little farm where everything was organic, we weren't using all these plastics, we weren't using all this energy. I think part of it is maybe just this drawback to what we imagine was a very sustainable past.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, one of the many things I like about the book is that having often explained to people, look, this thing that you're worried about, you shouldn't be worried about this. This thing that we're doing is not really helping. This other thing that's going on, this is really helpful. You're sort of laying out the facts, but then you just offer people really practical advice, both in policy terms, like this is what the priorities should be for our governments, and also in personal terms, like when you're making decisions about the food you eat, here's what you might want to bear in mind. You're not prescriptive, but you give people the information they need to make the decisions. So what advice, if I were to come to you and say, look, I realize this is a global problem, but I'm worried about the climate. I want to reduce my personal carbon footprint. What are the 3 things that I should think about doing that are going to make the biggest difference?
Oh, 3, that's a constraint. I think part of the issue I
You
often
can have
have.
2 or 10 if you like. I don't mind.
No, I think the fewer the better. I
Yeah.
think one of the problems I often have with environmental messaging on individual action is that you have books that are like 100 ways to save the planet, and no one has time to make 100 decisions. I
Yeah.
think part of the problem is there's no prioritization there. So if you could only make 5 decisions, my worry is that people are really well intentioned, but they make the 5 decisions which don't make a difference, like the plastic bag and the plastic straw.
Yeah.
So I think the 5 core things I would say is, one, eat less meat, especially beef and lamb. That would
Yeah.
be my one recommendation. The other big part of your carbon footprint is road transport. So if you have a car, try to use it less. So walk, public transport, cycle. If you really need a car, an electric one is definitely better than a petrol or diesel one. Another big one is flying. That's obviously a big one, primarily for people in the rich world, because most of the world do not fly. Home heating. So a big thing there is, like, one, if you can reduce the temperature slightly, but uh, a big thing you can do if you can afford it is to install a heat pump. It's just way better for the environment than a gas boiler. And then another big thing is like home energy. Like if you can install a solar panel, definitely do it. I think a lot of these are constrained by finance and living conditions. A lot of them I can't do because I currently rent a flat, so I can't install a heat pump. I can't put a solar panel on the roof. But I think these are just these probably make up around 80% of your footprint. And if you want to do the rest, great. But I don't think we should do that on the basis that we assume we're having a massive impact with those small decisions.
Yeah. Oh, and one idea that you mentioned in your book that had never occurred to me, and I was like, why did that never occur to me? Is hybrid burgers. So obviously, if you're concerned about animal rights, you want to be vegetarian. You're not going to eat a beef burger. You want to eat something else. But if you're willing to eat some beef, but you want to reduce the carbon footprint, it could be part beef, part chicken, part plant protein. Or hybrid burgers. Why did I never think of hybrid burgers? Where can I buy a hybrid burger? Are they coming?
I think there are a few companies that do a mix now, but I mean, you can immediately see how that would work, right? Like, we need to move away from, we need to, globally, we need to eat less meat, right?
Yeah.
And people are often quite reluctant to do that, and we might see quite a slow change there. But the point is, you can still eat your beef burger, but you could, like, we could half beef consumption if we just did a half and half burger.
Yeah. Yeah.
And people would probably not really notice the difference. The texture would probably be the same. The taste would pretty much be the same. I mean, it would be a very, very quick way to do it and should really have no impact on kind of uh, people's enjoyment of the food.
And what would you say to someone who said, "Look, you've told us that everything's basically going to be fine as long as we do a bit of this and that. We'll have chicken burgers instead of beef burgers, and we'll install some more solar panels." And you are fundamentally missing the point. The point here is economic growth is unsustainable, fundamentally unsustainable. Our current model is totally broken, and degrowth is what we need. We actually need to shrink the world population, and we need to shrink the world economy. That would be the pushback from not generally from economists like me, but certainly the pushback from a lot of environmentalists. What's your response to that?
Yeah, again, I get the intuition there. I think there are really different, I guess, flavors of degrowth. What I'm quite explicit about in the book is that we can't go for global degrowth, right? The world is too poor for us to start to try to shrink the global economy. Like, if you do that, you leave billions of people in poverty.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's a different question of should we deliberately try to reduce consumption and shrink in rich countries, which seems more feasible. My one,
Unless you're
my,
a politician,
I mean,
then
I
this is
mean,
infeasible at all.
yeah, I
But
mean,
yeah,
yeah, that's one of my core points is that I just don't think that messaging is ever going to get through politically. Like, I cannot see a politician standing up and winning an election with that as one of their key slogans. And I think the time component there is really important. Like, I think many of the pushback I would get often from showing that the UK has increased its GDP while reducing emissions. So, what we call decoupling of these two metrics. The pushback is that it's not happening fast enough, and it's not happening fast enough. But I think my contest towards people arguing that degrowth would be a better way of doing that is what is the timescale for us to get to a place where a politician is willing to stand up, um, go for that as a core message, people to vote for them, and then actually put that into practice. That's not going to be a fast process. So the argument seems to me to fall apart if you're trying to argue that decoupling is not going to happen fast enough. Degrowth will also not happen fast enough. Now, another key part of the argument of degrowth is that maybe it's less about GDP and we can just reduce energy use. And in some sense, yeah, I think there's many areas where we can reduce energy use. But a core part of moving to a low carbon economy is when we go through the energy transition, that will happen anyway. Our current energy system based on fossil fuels is incredibly inefficient. um, 2/3 of the energy we burn is wasted. Like, it doesn't go towards actually our energy services. So moving us around, powering our homes and our laptops, like, is wasted as heat. So when you decarbonize the economy, you take away most of that waste. So your final energy demand is going to be much, much lower anyway. So we are actually going to reduce energy demand anyway. We're not going to have to produce this massive stack of energy that we are producing today. And we still get the same welfare benefits that we all want. So to me, I think just a much better messaging strategy for this is look, we can actually tackle both of these things at the same time. And I just don't think that we're going to make any progress if we try to frame it as we need to shrink the economy in order to tackle climate change.
we're nearly running out of time. But if you are game, I wanted to finish up by asking you to play a round of overrated and underrated. This is
Okay,
a
perfect.
game my friend the economist Tyler Cowen likes to play. So I'm gonna tell you some stuff, and I want you to tell me whether you think they're overrated or underrated. And if you fancy offering a sentence or two of explanation, then by all means. But let's go for it. Okay, vertical farms.
Overrated. Like, they just consume so much energy. It's just not economically feasible, and it would just wreck the planet.
Okay, chicken.
Underrated. I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of people like have a resistance to being told to eat less meat. From a climate perspective, you can actually do a substitution of meat and have a big impact. So if you substituted beef for chicken, so if you got rid of your beef burger and had a chicken burger instead, it would have a massive reduction in your climate impact.
Okay. Going palm oil free.
Overrated. Palm oil is a problem, but it's potentially less of a problem than the alternatives. So I think the strategy there is not to boycott and get rid of it. I think it's to produce more sustainable supply chains.
Okay. Hybrid cars.
Like plug-in hybrid.
Yeah.
A few years ago, I would have said underrated. I'm now overrated. I think we can just go fully battery electric.
Okay. And paper straws.
Oh, overrated. Oh, they're just terrible. Like paper and water should not go together. I don't know who thought that was a good idea.
Yeah, we don't actually need straws at all, do we? I guess
No.
is the yeah, but there we go. But what we do need is this book. Not the end of the world. It's fantastic. Margaret Atwood loves it. I love it. We're very grateful to Hannah Ritchie for writing it, and very grateful to you, Hannah, for coming and joining us on Intelligence Squared. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. I loved the conversation.